guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and today I'm going to show you how I built my new bathroom vanity. Now, I know what you're thinking, Shara, this isn't a bathroom. And you are right, this is my workshop, but I'm kicking off a bathroom remodel project very soon, and before I started demolishing everything, I wanted to make sure I had something to replace it with, so I went ahead and built the vanity before I started the bathroom project. You will definitely see this again later in that video, but for now, I'm gonna show you how I built it, and just use your imagination because I'm still waiting for the vanity top to be cut. So for now, it's topless. Anyway, if you're ready to see how the base of it came together, I'm excited to share it with you, so let's get building. This video was sponsored by Removeable. So you guys are always asking me about my creative process and if I sit down and draw out my projects in software to create a cut list before I get started. And no, I actually only draw out my projects in software after they've been built, just so I can create plans to share with you guys. Software is great, but I actually prefer the freedom to just sketch out, erase, and make notes as needed when I'm designing my projects. So to get started with this project, I actually sketched out my vanity design based on the overall dimensions that I wanted it to be, made some notes, and scribbled a rough cut and materials list to get me started. I'll figure out the details as I go and make notes on my sketch for making the plans later. I used to keep a notebook full of sketches, notes, to-do lists, deadlines, and project ideas, but this was a very unorganized way to keep up with my business and my project details. So I upgraded to the Remarkable 2 paper tablet, which combines the benefits of technology with the classic feel and freedom of pencil and paper. Remarkable 2 is a tablet that looks, feels, and even sounds like paper. But it comes with digital powers. I can create folders and use templates to save, organize, and send my sketches, notes, and lists, but it allows me to do my best uninterrupted thinking without all the social media notifications, emails, and other distracting pop-ups that I would get on a computer or a phone. This tablet has many benefits to both my building process and my small business. I can convert notes and lists to text to give me a kickstart on putting together my building plans. I can also read and review documents and sign PDFs. And one of my favorite features, I don't find myself at the hardware store without my list anymore because I can access and view all of my files on my Remarkable 2 tablet right from my phone. Check out the link in my description below to experience the power of the Remarkable 2 paper tablet for yourself and to see all the benefits that it has to offer your workshop and your business. Okay, now that we have this vanity sketched out and a rough cut list to get started with, let's dive into this build. I built this vanity frame out of cedar. Now, obviously if you're building your own, you can use whatever type of wood that you'd like, but I've been on a cedar kick lately, so I just went with that. My cedar here was pretty rough, so I planed it down, cut them to rough lengths on the miter saw, then squared off the edges on the table saw. All the dimensions for this project can be found in the plans linked below. You can certainly use 4x4s for the legs here, but I just glued together 2x4s to make my own. This is a little cheaper than buying 4x4s, and I can use the leftover 2x4s for the other parts of the build later. Once the glue was dry on these legs, I cleaned up the edges and cut them down to 3 inches by 3 inches on the table saw. Then I trimmed them to a final length of about 34 inches. Now I debated over and over and over again whether I wanted to glue up solid cedar panels for the sides, and ultimately I just decided to use 3/4 inch birch plywood instead. It was cheaper, easier, and had less potential for issues later. The only downside was that there was a chance that the colors may not match well. So I picked a sheet that had some darker streaks in it to kind of tie into the cedar, and it ended up looking surprisingly similar, which you'll see at the end. Once I had my 2 side panels cut, I assembled them between the legs using pocket holes and screws so that they were about 3/4 inch inset from the outside edge of the leg. Once the side panels were made, I moved on to the frame, and I feel like the frame needs a little disclosure because there were a lot of quote-unquote unnecessary things that I added to the frame for the sole purpose of visual design. As in, they're just for look and have no structural purpose. One of those is the trim pieces on the top and bottom of the front frame. I cut 3 pieces of 2x4 to make the vanity frame from. 2 of these were for the front and 1 was for the back. For the front pieces, I ripped about a 1/2 inch off the width. That gave me a 3-inch wide piece that I'll use for the structural frame, and the thin, about 1/2 inch thick piece will go on the front as trim. The third 2x4 I just ripped in half to make 2x2s for the back frame. Now, stick with me here. I drilled pocket holes into the ends of the 3-inch wide pieces and the 2x2s. I installed the 3-inch wide pieces at the front, 1 at the top and 1 about 4 inches from the bottom. And I installed the 2x2s at the back. You could use full 2x4s here, just like the front, but it's not necessary. Using 2x2s here just saved me from having to buy another 2x4. I installed the bottom 2x2 in the back, even with the bottom 2x4 on the front. Once I had one side, I flipped it over and attached it to the other side. Notice that I used 1 screw and wood glue on the 2x2s. You can use 2 screws, but I found that they're likely to split when trying to drive 2 screws into a 2x2, so I usually just use 1 screw and some wood glue. Now I'm going to come back and add the little trim pieces that I mentioned earlier in just a second, but first I need to explain another unnecessary detail that I added. I cut and installed 2x2s to divide the vanity into drawer and cabinet sections in the middle using pocket holes and screws. That was a necessary part. However, in addition to these 2 in the middle, I also glued 2 on the outside between the top and the bottom frame on the legs. These are purely for visual interest and aren't actually necessary. I just really like the look of an entire frame being inset from the front of the legs. Once these pieces were installed, I glued the thin trim pieces that I cut off earlier onto the frame at the top and the bottom for an additional detail. With the frame together, I moved on to adding the divider panels. I cut 2 3/4 inch plywood panels to size and used a jigsaw to notch out the back corners to fit. Then I drilled pocket holes into only the front edges of these panels. I installed these flush to the inside of the drawer section using pocket holes and screws. Then I used 2-inch wood screws at the back corners to secure them in place. After both panels were installed, I moved on to the drawers. I flipped the vanity over on its side for this to make things a little easier, and I cut and added 2x2s to divide the drawers. I installed these dividers so that the openings were equal, and I used pocket holes and screws on the back side to secure them. Then I screwed 16-inch drawer slides into the sections so that they were 3/4 inch inset from the front edge to allow for inset drawer fronts later. I have a detailed guide that I will link in the description for how to install drawer slides. Once all 3 pair of slides were in, I was ready to move on to building the drawers. Now, if you've seen many of my videos, this process probably looks pretty familiar. I have a ton of plywood scraps in my shop right now, so I just cut some of those to make my drawer boxes from. However, I've got a plywood cut diagram in the plans linked below if you're cutting everything from a full sheet. Once I cut my drawer box pieces in the correct lengths, I ran them through the table saw to cut dados to install a 1/4 inch plywood bottom. Then I assembled the boxes using pocket holes and screws. One quick note about the pocket hole placement. Obviously, you're welcome to assemble your drawer boxes however you'd like, but if you use pocket holes here like I do, you'll need to drill the holes pretty close to the edges. Normally, I would install a solid piece of wood on the front of these boxes as the drawer front, which would completely cover the holes. However, in this case, I just glued the trim along the front of these boxes. So if the pockets are drilled too far from the edge, they won't be covered by the trim. You'll see this more a little later. I used some scrap 1/4 inch plywood pieces to help me install these into the vanity so that they were about a 1/4 inch above the frame pieces below. Once the drawers were in, I moved on to the doors. So I'm going to share a cheater's way of making a nice, simple cabinet door. So please ignore my makeshift band-aid. So I took a 1x6 tongue and groove board and I ripped it in half, and I'm only using the groove side, which basically is already a pre-cut dado for you and a pre-cut chamfer on the end here for a little decorative detail. So I cut 45s on these pieces, used a square right here to make a mark, then used my dowel jig to drill dowel holes in the ends so I can assemble this together. And this groove right here is about 1/4 inch. So I can use a 1/4 inch piece of plywood to install inside the grooves here, and then just use glue and wood dowels to assemble this door. And then I get something that looks like this. I have a separate video that I'll link below on how I build cabinet doors, and this process is very similar, except that in this case I could skip cutting a dado and adding a decorative edge because these tongue and groove boards already had these cut for me. So I simply ripped these boards down on the table saw, then I cut these at 45 degrees on the miter saw. I used a square to mark the lines at each corner and a dowel jig to drill dowel holes to assemble them. Then I glued and clamped these doors together. While the glue dried on the doors, I cut down the tongue off the other side of the boards that I cut down for the door frames. I used these pieces to trim out the door fronts. To make things easy, I flipped the vanity on its back and just applied some wood glue around the edges of the door fronts. Then I placed this trim on and got it positioned so that the gaps on all sides were even, then slowly backed away and just didn't touch anything until it dried. Super scientific technique here. I'm sorry about the tractor background noise. Please disregard. While the trim is drying on the drawers, I'm going to go ahead and work on the bottom panel. So I'm going to make this bottom panel removable so it will just set in place and then I can pop it out if I need to. The reason for that is because we clean our P-traps fairly regularly. So whenever I build a vanity for myself, I like to make the bottom removable so that when we clean our P-traps, we don't get that dirty, nasty P-trap water on the bottom of the cabinet. So that being said, I have some of these like scrap pieces of plywood. They're just about 3/4 by 3/4. So you could obviously use a square dowel. You could trim your own scrap pieces here. I just happen to have these in my scrap wood like room. So I'm just gonna cut one for the front and one for the back and just glue these right here so that I can cut my panel and set them on top of these scrap pieces. I cut and glued these scrap pieces onto the vanity frame for the removable bottom panels. Take note that the bottom front and the bottom back frame pieces aren't the same size. The tops are at the same height though, so be sure to install these pieces the same distance down from the top edge so that they'll be level to each other. While these support pieces dried, I cut down 2 3/4 inch plywood panels to fit and used a jigsaw again, just like with the divider panels, to notch out the corners where the legs are. I flipped the vanity right side up again and set these in place. Now the last part is just adding the doors. Once the glue had all dried on the doors, I gave them a good sanding to even out the joints and remove all the glue residue. Then I used a Craig concealed hinge jig to drill out the holes to install the concealed hinges. So I'm using inset hinges for frameless cabinets, which means that I'm gonna have to put some spacer blocks here behind these hinges. They make inset hinges for like face frame cabinets, but since these are not your typical face frame, like they're 1.5 inches thick, it wasn't gonna work. So the easiest thing to do in this case is just to use frameless hinges and spacer blocks. For each door, I cut 2 spacer blocks to install behind the hinges. The outside spacer blocks will be thicker than the inside spacer blocks, so it's best to cut these blocks to fit for each door. You basically just need a block large enough to mount the hinge to and thick enough for it to come flush to the edge of the frame pieces on each side of the door. I screwed these blocks in where the hinges will mount, then just mounted the hinges to the blocks. Once the doors were installed, concealed hinges come with adjustment options to adjust as needed to get them evenly spaced. After the doors were installed, I gave it a few coats of poly to finish everything up. I was really nervous that I was going to ruin my entire project, but I was honestly pleasantly surprised how well it turned out. Apparently, birch matches cedar pretty good. I added knobs to the doors and handles to the drawers, and because the inset hinges tend to allow the doors to close too far, I did add some catches here at the bottom to act as a stop. And now it's just ready and waiting for the day that it gets installed in our new bathroom and the top gets put on it. I'll share more about that in a later video, so be sure to subscribe to keep up with all the upcoming projects and videos. I hope you guys enjoyed this project, and don't forget to check out the plans linked below for all the details and dimensions. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!